First, I want to thank those of you that are strong enough to have lasted this long, and to let you know that I'm part of the entertainment, so you should feel free to leave now, or to begin the entertainment followed by the concert and the banquet. I'm also not going to use PowerPoint, so you'll get a little rest for your eyes. Synthetic biology, from the perspective of somebody who works on ethics and law, and in my case mostly public policy, is a really interesting field because in some ways it's a perfect storm, and I don't know how many of you know that it is coming right your way. It's a perfect storm of ethics and public policy because it brings together several strands of concerns that have been dogging other fields over the years, but they all seem to come together in synthetic bio. Clearly, one is national security. I'm sure this is the one that most of you have heard about most frequently, the concerns around the possibility of dual-use technology, which I'll talk about in just a moment rather briefly. That is, things that can be used for all of these wonderfully interesting and benign purposes also being turned toward purposes that are related to bioterrorism and biowarfare. The second is, and that's of course reminiscent of the debates around the atomic bomb, and nuclear energy. And the second is the questions about environmentalism and sustainable environmentalism. If you think back to the 1970s, the concerns about recombinant DNA leading to the release of engineered organisms that would fundamentally upset the ecosystem, and the kind of outcry that led to, one that we in fact still are suffering from, particularly in Europe with regard to GM crops, and to a large extent in the United States as well. You realize that you're walking into that particular storm as well when it comes to the synthesizing of organisms. And finally, and I can't begin to tell you how grateful I am to Professor Whitesides for having said this as a scientist rather than just coming in as a public policy person, but the fact that everything here begins to relate to the idea of creating forms of life in some fashion or another goes directly to what are probably the deepest sets of inchoate, poorly articulated concerns on the part of the public about somehow upsetting our most cherished notions about God and creation. And if you just take a look at the debates around cloning, I'm not talking about reproductive cloning, I'm talking about cloning in the laboratory for the purpose of simply doing basic in vitro research on embryonic stem cells. You have a sense of the kind of vitriol that can follow any scientist who wants to work on something that, for some people, represents the usurpation of God's role in creating life. And just to let you know that you guys are walking into all three of these together. And what makes it even more interesting is that these three do not sort themselves out cleanly as left-wing or right-wing issues. In fact, in many cases, what we're seeing now is an interesting convergence from left and right for different reasons. People from the conservative end of the political spectrum often are also more religious and tend to have objections that are grounded in theological concerns, excuse me, whereas the people from the left, who are disproportionately secular, nonetheless tend to have a kind of attachment to a kind of a non-religious spiritualism and a belief in the goodness of nature in its purest form, however they imagine nature to be, and so become very suspicious of anything that alters nature, and that's particularly true when it's in a commercial context, as biotechnology has been. So for observers like me who watch these scientific fields developing, and for scientists who are in these fields who want to make sure that their sources of funding are not cut off and that their work is not made illegal, it is a challenge. You laugh, but it's possible. The challenge is to anticipate some of these concerns, whether or not you share them and whether or not you think they're rational or reasonable, to anticipate them, to try and understand how these kinds of laboratory experiments are perceived by those who are not in the field, to address the concerns proactively, and from my perspective as a lawyer, to keep a close eye on the very tricky relationship between debates around what's right and wrong and debates around what should be legal and illegal, which from my perspective are totally separable debates that often get conflated in American public policy discussions. I'm going to move very quickly because I know how long you guys have been here, but let me just take those three things and just spell out a little bit more the kinds of things that have happened and where they'll fit with SynBio. National security. You know, outside of classified research, there lies a gray zone of research that some have called sensitive research. It's a very poorly defined area of research, but it's mostly characterized by this notion of dual use. One of the examples that was brought to my attention early on was the development of a vector for gene therapy that would evade the natural immune system so that you could now deliver what you wanted to deliver to the target area. So, for example, being able to evade the immune system in order to deliver a correction for the CF mutation. But the same kind of thing that might be used to engineer a vector that evades the immune system for gene therapy also would threaten to allow you to engineer a pathogen in a fashion that prevents us from developing a defense based on vaccines, because once again, the immune system has been essentially made irrelevant. And this kind of dual-use work can come up in a whole variety of other areas, whether it's in the enhancing of the pathogenicity or the resistance of an organism, or many other kinds of things. So we began to see, a number of years ago, calls for restrictions either on the research itself or on the publication of the research results. And it really built up some public notice when it came time to trying to replicate the genomes for known pathogens like polio and smallpox. It led to a call for the creation of this kind of intermediate category that would be administered by the government. The national academies actually stepped into this breach with a committee that worked on this, looking at ways to prevent the destructive uses of biotechnology, and looked particularly at issues around censorship or at least modification of publication of research results. It was I had the privilege of serving on that committee, and I have to tell you, one of the really interesting challenges there was really cultural. It was not technical. This was a committee made up of people who had in their past worked for the CIA, were currently working for the military, scientists from all over the country. And this was in, what, 2004 or something like that, and it was like watching the Vietnam War be refought, because there was such a cultural divide between the scientists, who tended to have an intrinsic distrust of the government and viewed all the government-related people as being prone toward conspiracy, oppression, and a disrespect for the value of inquiry and an overly cautious attitude toward national security. The people who had backgrounds in government tended to view the scientists as wild, out-of-control, irresponsible children who just wanted to play with their toys. And this this really hurt the conversation at the table, because when people would want to try to find some reasonable way of trying to accommodate the goal of free inquiry with the goal of avoiding any unnecessary gifting of technology and knowledge to those who were bent on using it for destructive purposes, there was such mutual suspicion that every compromise was viewed as simply a crack in the door toward something bad. It was either a crack in the door toward, you know, complete censorship, or was a crack in the door towards having a system that had so many loopholes that it afforded no protection at all. And that degree of suspicion around the table really, really stopped the committee from its work for a long time, until finally some relationships were built. And so, although this is not so much ethics as it is public policy, one of the first things that I learned in this area in the national security context is that personal relationships matter, and that developing some appreciation for one another's goals and some trust that they are not really out to hurt you is important. And I understand how hard this is, because when we're talking about censorship, we're talking about the limitation of civil liberties, and we all know that civil liberties are in fact the first casualty of war. We see that every war. We see it over and over, and we see it in this particular area as well. For those of you that are not aware of it, the first little step of compromise and partnering here is in the form of the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity, which is within the National Institutes of Health. And it's trying to set out a series of principles. Right now, its 2007 report is like blah, 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 very, very general. But it does start with the important thing about recognizing that the science is valuable. It's valuable intrinsically. It's valuable for its potential applications for the benefit of humankind. And therefore, we start with the idea that we're not trying to stop this. It seems obvious, but it's actually important to say it, because it helps put the brakes on everybody else's kind of inclination to then put in restrictions. It emphasizes self-regulation as a means for both assuring the quality of the work, the safety of the work, and to assure the public that the work is being pursued in a responsible fashion. And indeed, it reaches back to the examples of the 1970s when the Asilomar Conference became the model for self-regulation in the field of biotechnology, and probably saved the field from what could have been a kind of cascade of onerous municipal and state legislative reactions. I mean, Cambridge and Berkeley, ironically, having probably the most vociferous debates, and Berkeley having passed legislative restrictions on biotechnology to the point that Emeryville next door now is the site of all the good property tax income that Berkeley so desperately needs. It was also a partnership because Asilomar's self-regulation by the scientists, setting out a risk-based approach for incremental protections and for the identification of experiments whose risks were still not well understood enough for us to comfortably proceed no matter what restrictions we place on ourselves, partnered with the federal government, with NIH, with the development of the recombinant DNA advisory committee, which set out these guidelines for how to proceed, and for a while reviewed every single experiment. And then over time, as the risks began to be better understood, and in fact turned out to be much lower than we had feared, and as the protocols got to be standardized, the RAC's role began to diminish, and its bureaucratic burden began to diminish until finally its entire authority was removed and it became advisory only. And the FDA and the EPA took over the ordinary regulatory issues associated with the development of drugs and pesticides and whatever. This is a wonderful example of a process in which self-regulation by the profession then gets partnered with some degree of government regulation, which really takes advantage of all of what the professional self-regulation has taught it, and then together it begins to dissipate as the understanding proceeds. And we think we're seeing exactly the same thing in the stem cell field, where we started with National Academy's guidelines. Those guidelines became the basis for California, New York, and other state legislative and administrative rulemaking. Now the NIH is back in the funding field full-time, and they've adopted a set of guidelines which are largely modeled after the National Academy's guidelines. And one of the key things in the Academy's guidelines, the creation of special review committees called escrows, are no longer necessary under NIH rules, and they may very well begin to vanish from the university scene. So it's a wonderful opportunity to think about ways to anticipate concerns and address them here, safety concerns and national security, with the confidence that it doesn't mean that you're inviting oppressive regulation permanently into the future, but you may actually be, as my contracts professor would say in my first semester, the winner, because the first person who puts it down on paper always wins. That was the most important lesson I had in law school. Second, beyond national security, what you all are talking about, the democratization of science via Drew Endry's BioBricks, where now a much wider group of people have the capacity to participate in the research, the construction of the minimal genome, and the construction of cells that will serve as a kind of chassis that you can drop things into, all becoming part of this notion of being able to synthesize forms of life, is frequently referred to by those who follow it at all as, quote unquote, playing God. This is a very, very dangerous phrase, and I want to digress very briefly on that phrase just for a moment. Playing God is used all the time in the press as something that's wrong. It's bad because humans shouldn't play God. And God's role is as creator, as master, as maker, as director, as intelligent designer, and we are supposed to be none of those things. So playing God is a usurpation of God's role, and it's an act of hubris on our part. But that is grounded in a very specific theological view of playing God. So to give you just some ammunition when you're talking with people, let them understand that while there are some Christian denominations where that view of God and man's relationship may be true, and where the acceptance of God's will is a form of grace, and that's one theological view, other Christian denominations and virtually all Jews and Muslims do not accept this and see instead this kind of partnership role in which God and man work together in creation, and therefore it's not inappropriate to distort nature, to change nature, to engineer nature, and to try to improve nature if you can. So for one thing, this idea of playing God might be misused because in a sense what we are doing by other theological notions is playing human every time we manipulate and toy with things. Nonetheless, this phrase has really captured the imagination of the press, and it'll be used with rhetorical enthusiasm, and it's certainly been levied against a whole variety of things associated with making life, whether it's in vitro fertilization in the 1980s, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis for the screening of embryos in the 1990s, gene therapy, especially germline therapy, which suddenly popped up back in the news in the last year, and most notably, of course, in the last 10 years, against cloning, this idea that somehow it is wrong for us to make life or manipulate life at this fundamental level. And in the case of cloning, as an object lesson for you, the playing God argument was the single basis for the call to criminalize cloning research in the laboratory, and it was an argument that was successful on both the left and the right. Twice the US House of Representatives passed bills to criminalize that research. The Senate came up to about 43 votes in favor of it. If they'd managed to get just a few more votes, that bill would have gone to the president of the previous administration and would have been signed. It's a phenomenon that led to a whole series of talks on my part around the country in the stem cell field called From Stem Cells to Jail Cells, because it was a really remarkable example of criminalizing basic science research, not because it hurt anybody in particular, but because it was somehow wrong for humans to play God, which seemed to me to be a fairly amorphous and potentially unconstitutional basis on which to pass criminal legislation that would substantially restrict the liberty and, in my mind, the freedom of scientific inquiry. These are calls that are based upon fears that are about non-physical issues. It's moral harms, it's undermining adherence to religion, it's taking away reverence for the wonder of life, it's undermining respect for human dignity. And we have a very long history beyond the US of these kinds of reactions to scientific inquiry that challenges these really fundamental notions about the origins of life and our place in the universe. I'm sure most of you know about Galileo being excommunicated for having advocated Copernican views about the relationship between the Earth and the Sun in an astronomical way. What you may not have ever heard was Goethe's description of that Copernican effect, where he talked about how the world had scarcely become known as round and complete in itself when it was asked to waive the tremendous privilege of being the center of the universe. Never perhaps was a greater demand made on mankind, for by this admission, he said, so many things vanished in mist and smoke. What became of our Eden, our world of innocence, piety, and poetry? No wonder his contemporaries did not wish to let all this go and offered up every possible resistance to a doctrine which in its converts authorized and demanded a freedom of view and greatness of thought so far unknown. And this kind of resistance will come from every quarter of society if the work in some fashion suggests that you can, as human beings, take a bunch of off-the-shelf chemicals and make a cell. Because from making a cell comes making two cells, and then comes making a complex organism. And to the extent that, as we saw in just the last set of slides, there is a kind of Darwinian or evolutionary view of the development from cell to complex organism to human that has to be accepted, then this would suggest that at the base of all of this is nothing that involves a deity, at least for some people's interpretations. And you will find, as they did with Copernicus, every possible resistance to this doctrine. There's one last thing I want to mention as we're closing, and that is the classic slippery slope set of arguments. Because in between the kind of concern about the rupture of the moral fabric of society on the one hand, and the concern about the very concrete harms in the most immediate sense from the national security of people, will come the seemingly reasonable middle ground set of objections having to do with slippery slope arguments. They're focused on the applications of the research. Now, it happens that just in the last month, I became a total devotee of Battlestar Galactica. And for those of you here who know it, please do not tell me what happens. I want to be surprised by the ending. But for those that don't know, it's one of these kind of classics of dystopian science fiction, in which humankind builds machines. And the machines then become sentient. And then the sentient machines develop free will, and they rebel against their masters, and they cause the destruction of the human race. I mean, it's a classic sci-fi theme, but the reason it's a classic sci-fi theme is because it touches on many of these really kind of common mythological and religious images about the limits of human knowledge and the danger of human knowledge and the danger of using human knowledge. And here it's the danger of the application of making life, because it will come back to bite you. More realistically, you will find from people who you would ordinarily think of as being your kind of pro-science allies, yet a still kind of lingering concern that whatever it is that you're planning to do with all this stuff, that the distribution of its benefits will be inequitable because of the kind of economic system or social system we live in, or that it might lead to an over-enthusiastic adoption of technology such that we lose the natural diversity in favor of synthetic crops and animals that have been engineered to our specifications. Not a completely unrealistic concern considering what's happened in agribusiness in the United States. So slippery slope arguments may be the hardest because people will throw up at you after you've seen some of the most basic science research. They will throw up at you a series of slides showing all of the different kinds of downstream applications that are problematic and should be avoided. And so again, just to give you part of the arsenal of discussion in public policy, there is a response other than the response if we shouldn't do the research at all, or the response that we have to solve all these problems today before we do the research. And the response is incremental regulation as the applications begin to appear. In a sense, incremental approaches that will allow you to put certain brakes on things while the applications are developing, whether it's from the FDA or the EPA or the USDA, and you use them essentially as speed bumps on the slippery slope. In sum, properly understood, ethics would spend the half hour up here talking about all the benefits and how we're going to harness those benefits to the advantage of everybody. But unfortunately, it has become more and more often a discussion about possible harm and the things we must do to avert that harm. And I completely understand the need to avert certain kinds of concrete harms. I don't think anybody here would have any difficulty in complying with laboratory regulations that prevent the distribution of toxic or pathogenic substances, or if you're doing clinical research, of basic protections for human subjects. But I think it's also important that we begin to discuss an ethic of scientific inquiry that accepts serendipitous evolution of society in light of technological innovation, and accepts that we cannot direct the development of society, but we simply have to see where science takes us. I think that synthetic biology is going to test all of us. It's going to test the fears of bioterrorism, the worries about ecological distortions and disruption, and it's going to test our willingness to alter spiritual beliefs. There is a quote, however, from Thomas Jefferson on the side of the Keck building from the National Academy of Sciences in Washington that I think is one that's worth considering. It's from Thomas Jefferson. And in his words, "Liberty is the great parent of science and of virtue, and a nation will be great in both in proportion as it is free." Thank you very much.